Settle into whatever place has found you tonight. Let the room grow quiet around you, and if you wish, leave a comment telling us where in the world you are listening from. Perhaps it is late where you are. Perhaps the windows have become dark mirrors, and the ordinary hours are beginning to loosen their hold. Now imagine another darkness, far older than our own. The moon hangs above the Nile, turning the water to a long ribbon of tarnished silver. Beyond the riverbank, a temple rises from the plain. Its outer walls are pale beneath the stars, immense and still, while the last warmth of the day escapes from the stone. In the broad court columns stand like a grove that has forgotten the wind. A faint trace of incense lingers near an offering table. Somewhere in the shadows, bare feet pass softly over the floor. Imagine entering through the great gateway, as crowds once did on festival days, and looking toward the deeper rooms. But we would not be permitted to follow every passage. The temple narrows as it reaches inward. Sunlit courts give way to pillared halls, and halls to chambers where fewer people were permitted to go. At its heart, behind doors and curtains, rests the image of a god in a darkness carefully guarded. Who was allowed to cross that final threshold? Who knew the words spoken there before sunrise, the order of the offerings, the names written on papyrus, the medicines, calendars, royal ceremonies, and sacred stories preserved beyond public view? Modern imagination offers an enticing answer. It pictures a hidden brotherhood moving quietly behind the throne, passing secret wisdom from one generation to the next, shaping pharaohs and monuments while remaining unseen. Ancient Egypt, with its sealed chambers and enigmatic signs, almost invites such a story. Yet the truth is both quieter and more interesting. No surviving document reveals a single society commanding Egypt from the shadows. There is no known membership roll for an ancient order that ruled every temple and advised every king. What the evidence does reveal is a world of restricted knowledge. Priests, scribes, physicians, ritual experts, administrators, and learned families whose work connected the sanctuary to the palace, the archive, the granary, and the royal tomb. Among the institutions associated with this world was one called the House of Life, the Per-Ankh, a name that sounds mysterious even before we understand what it meant. Its traces are scattered. They appear in titles carved in stone, in fragments of papyrus, in decrees, in stamped bricks, and in the architecture of places where access itself carried meaning. Taken together, these traces point not to a theatrical conspiracy, but to something more enduring, networks of trained people who guarded, copied, interpreted, and applied knowledge on which the order of the kingdom seemed to depend. Tonight, we will follow those traces slowly. We will move from what can be read in inscriptions to what can only be inferred, and from ancient institutions to the legends later ages built around them. There will be no need to force open every locked door. It is enough to stand for a moment at the threshold, listening as the temple settles into the hour before dawn. For the people who lived and worked within these walls, secrecy did not necessarily mean what it means to us. We tend to imagine secret societies as separate bodies concealed inside the larger world. Sworn members, coded signs, hidden leaders, and a private purpose opposed to public life. It is an image shaped by much later institutions and by the stories told about them. Carry it unchanged into ancient Egypt, and we risk searching for the wrong thing while overlooking the forms of secrecy that stood plainly before everyone. An Egyptian temple was not hidden. It dominated the landscape. Its gateways stood within sight from far away, and its festivals had the power to draw entire communities into streets bright with banners, music, and processions. Yet within that very public monument, knowledge and access were arranged in layers. Standing in an outer court did not grant passage into the pillared hall. Serving the temple estate did not grant entry to the sanctuary. Even among priests, duties differed, and service could be organized by rank, office, purity, time, and place. The boundary around sacred knowledge was less like a wall surrounding a clandestine club, and more like a sequence of doors. Each door implied preparation. Those who took part in ritual washed, shaved, dressed, fasted, learned prescribed actions, and recited words whose effectiveness depended upon their correct performance. Not everyone who held a temple title was present every day, and practice varied from one period and place to another across Egypt's immense history. Still, the principle remained recognizable. Closeness to the divine required controlled conduct. To know was also to be responsible for doing. Some Egyptian titles make this world sound especially tantalizing. Officials could be called keepers or masters of secrets. Translations of titles connected with the Egyptian expression Hrai Seshta. The phrase did not automatically identify membership in a single hidden order. A secret might be a restricted ritual, the sacred form of a god, the procedures of embalming, a royal matter, or specialized knowledge belonging to an office. A master of such secrets was not necessarily a conspirator. He was someone entrusted with what others were not authorized, trained, or ritually prepared to handle. That trust could pass along remarkably human paths. Sons followed fathers into scribal and priestly careers. Elite households formed marriages with other influential families. Teachers trained pupils. Senior officials sponsored younger men, and offices sometimes remained within family lines for generations. Such patterns could concentrate knowledge and influence without any central design. They could also exclude the ability to read difficult scripts, interpret old formulae, or perform exacting rites required time and instruction unavailable to most people. A network built from kinship, patronage, and education might appear almost invisible from outside, even when its members' names were carved openly on monuments. The carved titles can tempt us to make every inherited office a permanent dynasty, or every office holder part of a unified priestly caste. But Egypt lasted for more than 3,000 years under pharaonic rule, and its institutions changed. Temples rose and declined, capitals moved, offices were divided, combined, granted, and taken away. A title that carried great weight in one century might function differently in another. The picture is not of one brotherhood remaining untouched through all of history, but of overlapping communities that repeatedly preserved and remade their authority. Among the most intriguing points where these communities met was the House of Life, known in Egyptian as Per-Ankh. The name evokes a grand academy with long corridors and shelves of scrolls, but the surviving evidence does not allow us to reconstruct one standard building or organization that existed everywhere in the same form. The House of Life was associated with temples and kingship, with scribes and learned production, and with the preservation or creation of texts and images. In different settings, it appears connected to religious learning, ritual expertise, medicine, and the ordering of knowledge. Its precise shape remains partly beyond our sight. That uncertainty is not an empty space to be filled with fantasy. It is one of the most valuable things the evidence can tell us. Ancient institutions often survive unevenly. Papyrus decays, mud brick crumbles, and titles outlive the daily practices that once gave them meaning. What remains may be an official's inscription on a tomb wall, a royal decree, a fragment found near a palace archive, or a mark pressed into a brick. Each object offers a narrow window. None by itself opens the entire house. Step back from that narrow window and a wider landscape comes into view. The closest documented answer to our secret society question is not the House of Life alone. It is a world in which houses of life, temple staffs, royal administrators, scribal circles, healers, artisans, and families could share people, techniques, and interests. A scribe might serve religious and administrative needs. A physician might carry a priestly title. A ritual specialist might require astronomical timing, inherited formulae, and access to old written collections. Modern categories separate religion, medicine, art, scholarship, and government. Egyptian practice often allowed them to meet in the same trained hands. Such hands helped turn knowledge into continuity. Calendars determined festivals and offerings. Lists organized goods and personnel. Ritual texts guided ceremonies. Medical writings gathered remedies and spoken protections. Artists and scribes fixed royal names and divine forms upon temple walls. Archives preserved claims to land, service, and privilege. None of these tasks needed a hidden supreme council to make them powerful. Their influence came from repetition, from performing the rite again, copying the text again, teaching the next pupil, recording the next delivery, and placing the king once more within an ordered universe. How, then, can we follow a network whose edges were never drawn for us? We begin with what has survived. Inscriptions can tell us that a title existed and who claimed it, though not always what its bearer did each morning. Papyri preserve words and procedures, though their archaeological setting may be lost. Temple architecture reveals gradations of space, while scenes on its walls present an ideal order rather than a simple photograph of daily activity. Archaeology can locate workshops, storerooms, archives, and stamped bricks, but silence remains between the finds. So we follow the traces gently and patiently. Where a text speaks clearly, we can listen. Where several kinds of evidence meet, we can make a careful inference. Where later writers imagine Egyptian priests as guardians of timeless wisdom, we can appreciate the power of that image without confusing it with proof. Mystery need not disappear when certainty ends. It simply changes its character. And so the temple's closed door remains before us, not as evidence of a global conspiracy, but as evidence of boundaries. Beyond it were acts that required training. Around it were institutions that made training possible. Before we enter the house of life more fully, we must look back to an earlier transformation. When marks pressed into clay and cut into ivory first began to give a small number of people an extraordinary power, the power to make a command, a name, or a memory endure beyond the human voice. Those first marks were modest things. They did not yet fill the high walls of temples or run in careful lines across long rolls of papyrus. Near the end of the 4th millennium before our era, signs appeared on small labels, vessels, seal impressions, and objects associated with tombs and storehouses. A drawing might identify a place, a ruler, a commodity, or an institution. A sequence of signs could bind a name to a delivery, or a royal presence to an object that had travelled along the river. From such beginnings, writing entered Egyptian life not as a detached art, but as a way of joining people, goods, authority, and memory. The kingdom taking shape along the Nile extended beyond the reach of any human voice. Grain moved into storerooms. Linen, oil, cattle, stone, timber, and labour had to be gathered and directed. Officials needed to know what had arrived, where it belonged, and in whose name it had been received. Clay ceilings closed containers and doors, bearing impressions that connected their contents with an office or estate. Labels travelled with valuable goods into royal burials. The sign was small, but the claim behind it was immense. Someone had counted this. Someone had named it. Someone acting beneath royal authority had made the record. Writing did not create the Egyptian state by itself, and the earliest signs do not reveal a complete bureaucracy suddenly springing into existence. Their meanings are often difficult for us to recover, and the system developed over time. Yet writing offered rulers and administrators a new kind of reach. It allowed an instruction to pass through several hands without depending entirely on memory, kept a name attached to land, tribute, or a ceremonial gift after the speaker had gone, and carried an institution's mark across hundreds of objects. The state acquired, slowly and unevenly, a durable voice. To give marks, that voice required training. Egyptian writing joined pictures, sounds, and ideas in ways that rewarded long familiarity. Depending on context, the same bird served as a sound in one place, and as a sign of meaning in another. The arrangement itself mattered, as did the direction in which figures faced. Over the centuries, scribes used formal hieroglyphs for monuments and sacred display, while more rapidly written forms served the demands of ink, reed brush, ostrakon, wood, and papyrus. Reading was never simply a matter of recognizing a row of little pictures. It meant knowing conventions, vocabulary, context, and the purpose of a text. We do not have a reliable census of readers for most periods, and it would be misleading to offer a neat percentage for a civilization lasting thousands of years. Skills varied. Some people perhaps recognized names or common signs without composing difficult texts. A clerk accustomed to lists and accounts did not necessarily command old ritual language. A sculptor laying out an inscription could work from a prepared model. Still, advanced literacy remained restricted enough to distinguish those who possessed it. Time spent learning signs was time not spent entirely in fields, quarries, or workshops. Instruction required teachers, materials, institutional support, and access to texts worth copying. Imagine a young apprentice seated on the ground with a writing board across his knees. In the beginning there are no mysteries, only repetition, the reed held at the proper angle, a line copied, a mistake corrected, a list begun again. The materials themselves carry a lesson in value. Papyrus must be prepared and is not always used for casual practice. Broken pottery and limestone flakes offer cheaper surfaces. The student's hand learns to make signs swiftly enough for accounts and clearly enough for another trained eye. Alongside words come numbers, measures, titles, formulas of address, and the habits of obedience expected within an office. What begins as penmanship becomes entry into a particular world. A scribe can stand beside a storehouse and turn baskets of grain into columns of reckoning. He can accompany a work crew and preserve names, absences, allotments, and tools. He can draft a letter whose courtesies place writer and recipient within a hierarchy. He can copy a royal order, record an offering, or help prepare an inscription. Not every scribe performs all these duties, and surviving texts often show the polished ideal more clearly than the untidy day. But literacy creates the possibility of moving between spoken command and lasting form. Now lift your gaze from the apprentice's board to the temple wall. The scale changes, and the closeness of writing and kingship comes into view. The Egyptian king ruled not only through officials and force, but through an image of the world made visible. On stone, he could remain forever youthful, forever victorious, forever presenting gifts to the gods. A human reign filled with illness, negotiation, uncertainty, and passing years was refined into an enduring pattern. Royal names were enclosed, repeated, and carried across the country. Decrees gave privileges or instructions the weight of the throne. Annals selected what a reign wished to remember. What filled the stone was not ordinary reporting. Monumental inscriptions belonged to sacred and political space. They announced what ought to be eternally true. The king defeats disorder, honours the gods, protects Egypt, and sustains the conditions of life. Defeats, compromises, and failures rarely entered this perfected surface in the same way. The walls did not merely describe royal power. They performed it, placing the ruler within a universe governed by Ma'at. Ma'at is often translated with words such as truth, balance, justice, rightness, or order, yet no single English word quite contains it. It was the proper arrangement that allowed the sun to rise, the Nile Valley to flourish, offerings to reach the gods, judgments to be fair, and society to remain distinct from chaos. In official thought, the king upheld Ma'at. He presented it to the gods, defended it against enemies, and made it visible through ritual and rule. Writing served this work by fixing relationships that human life constantly threatened to disturb. A list could place goods in order. A boundary text could place land under a recognized claim. A calendar could place a festival in its proper season. A tomb inscription could place the dead within a remembered family and surround a name with prayers. A monument could place a new king inside an ancient succession. These were different kinds of writing, made for different audiences, but each resisted disappearance. To write something was to give it a form capable of outlasting a breath. This power had a shadow. What endured depended upon what trained people chose, or were commanded, to record. A monument could magnify one event and pass over another. A name could be carefully preserved or deliberately cut away. A damaged archive could silence a household's claim. Even errors acquired long lives when copied. Scribes did not control all reality, but they controlled many of the channels through which reality reached the future. For most Egyptians, the great inscriptions were present even when they could not be fully read. Hieroglyphs inhabited temple walls, statues, coffins, stelae, and sacred objects. Their forms participated in the authority of the scene. The written name helped preserve identity. The carved image helped make an offering perpetual. Words might be spoken, seen, touched, buried, concealed, or renewed. Literacy, therefore, did not divide a simple world of readers from a world entirely untouched by writing. It placed specialists at points where visible signs affected everyone, even when only a few could interpret every line. Those specialists were not a single society. They served courts, estates, temples, military offices, workshops, local administrations, and private households. They could compete for advancement, protect family interests, complain about superiors, or take pride in the security of their profession. Yet they shared a practical truth. The kingdom depended on people able to transform fleeting things into records. The crop had to become an account. The order had to become a document. The mortal ruler had to become a name that stone could remember. Over generations, collections accumulated. Old compositions were copied because they remained useful, prestigious, protective, or sacred. New texts were created in dialogue with inherited forms. Lists, rituals, medical recipes, hymns, administrative precedents, and models for images all required places, materials, and people to preserve them. Some knowledge circulated widely within trained communities. Some belonged to particular offices or settings. The deeper writing entered the machinery of Egypt, the more important became the question of where such knowledge lived. The answer was never one room, one archive, or one order. But among the names that emerge from the surviving traces, one carries us closer to the guarded centre than almost any other. It is the Per-Ankh, the House of Life, where the power of the written sign met the needs of temple and king. The name is evocative enough to furnish the House of Life before we have crossed its threshold. We may picture a serene library, shelves crowded with scrolls, senior priests whispering over ancient books, and initiates passing through a single doorway into an order that endured unchanged for centuries. The image has beauty, but more certainty than the evidence permits. Per-Ankh names a real Egyptian institution. Its surviving outlines shift according to period and place, and much of its daily life has vanished with the papyrus and mud brick from which that life was made. Begin with the words themselves, commonly rendered as House of Life. In Egyptian, a house could be more than a building. It could mean an organized domain, an office, a working institution, or the people and resources attached to it. Life in this setting was not merely biological existence. Written and ritual knowledge could preserve names, restore health, renew divine presence, and maintain the ordered world in which life continued. The title joined place, purpose, and sacred authority without telling us precisely how every house of life was staffed. Some of the earliest references wait in royal decrees from the late Old Kingdom, around 2200 before our era. The institution is already near kingship, present in an official landscape of temples, privileges, personnel, and written command. By the Middle Kingdom, individuals could bear the title of scribe of the House of Life. Such traces anchor the name in ancient administration rather than later imagination. Yet a title carved for eternity rarely includes the ordinary details we most want. It may tell us that a man belonged to the institution, but not the arrangement of his desk, the contents of the cupboards, or the conversation with which his working day began. As the centuries pass, the House of Life appears in association with the production and custody of learned material. Religious compositions, rituals, medical knowledge, scholarly lists, and the preparation of sacred images have all been connected with its sphere. This does not place every known text of these kinds inside one universal department, nor does it combine every skill in the same employees. Instead, the traces suggest a recurring institutional setting, where writing was treated as an active instrument, copied, organized, interpreted, adapted, and brought into use. Step closer, and the silent modern library dissolves into a workshop of knowledge. A roll of papyrus is opened carefully. An older exemplar lies beside a fresh surface. One scribe reads, another checks, or a single copyist moves patiently between the two. Black ink carries most of the text. Red may distinguish headings, instructions, warnings, or significant words according to the conventions of the composition. A damaged passage demands judgment. A rare sign must be remembered or sought in another model. The finished copy may serve a ceremony, a healer, an administrator, an artisan, or a royal commission. Copying was not passive. Every copy involved choices about layout, spelling, omission, correction, and the relation between old language and present need. A composition might survive because generations considered it authoritative, but survival did not require perfect stillness. Texts could be expanded, abbreviated, rearranged, or furnished with explanation. Images also carried rules. To design a divine figure or ceremonial scene was not simply to exercise personal taste. Names, attributes, proportions, gestures, and accompanying words helped make the representation ritually correct. Learned production joined the hand of the scribe to the hand of the artist. The brush moved, in other words, near several worlds at once. The House of Life belonged to the temple, where texts and images supported divine service. It belonged to kingship, which depended on correct names, rituals, and monuments. It touched healing, because remedies and spoken protections drew upon preserved knowledge. It touched scholarship, if by scholarship we mean the patient ordering of language, places, beings, materials, and inherited compositions. These categories are useful to us, but an Egyptian specialist might not have drawn their borders in the same places. Then, after centuries of titles and scattered references, the trail becomes solid beneath the hand. At Akhetaten, the capital now called Amarna, the House of Life leaves a rare material glimpse. Near the royal and sacred centre of the city, archaeologists found mud bricks stamped with signs naming the institution. Papyrus fragments from the broader complex add to the picture of written activity around palace, temple, and state archives. The finds do not restore a complete floor plan with every room labelled for us, and fragments displaced by time cannot answer every question of original use. Even so, the stamped bricks are wonderfully direct. For a moment, an institution otherwise known through titles and texts presses its own name into earth. Hold one of those bricks in imagination. It is sun-dried mud, practical and vulnerable, made for walls that could crumble while stone inscriptions survived elsewhere. The stamp does not reveal a secret doctrine. It reveals presence. Here, in the new city built under Akhenaten, stood a place or institution called the House of Life. Its survival in the archaeology of a reign known for religious upheaval complicates any easy story of an eternal underground brotherhood opposing the throne. The institution could exist within royal projects adapt to a changed capital, and serve forms of authority that were themselves being transformed. From that one brick, the trail scatters again across centuries. Holders of House of Life titles appear in different contexts. Later traditions associate houses of life with temple learning and the composition or restoration of sacred material. Some texts invoke guarded knowledge, while others display the practical discipline of classification. What unites these traces is not proof of a central command, but a durable relationship between trained people, written collections, and institutions that considered certain forms of knowledge essential to life and order. Access was naturally unequal. A beginner learning common signs did not immediately gain command of difficult ritual books. A clerk, skilled in deliveries, might pass an entire career without handling a medical composition. Rank, office, training, and ritual status governed who consulted or copied particular materials in different settings. The restriction was sometimes explicit and often practical. A dense text, written in an old form of the language, could guard itself through difficulty. A collection kept within a temple precinct could be closed to those without reason to enter. Knowledge belonged to the path by which one had been prepared to use it. Now follow that knowledge outward, beyond the guarded collection. A ritual text guided words spoken before a god. A model informed an image carved where others could see it. A medical compilation shaped treatment at a bedside. A learned list gave order to names that could later be taught or copied. Royal and funerary commissions carried specialized knowledge into monuments and tombs. The source could remain restricted, while the resulting form entered the visible world. Secrecy did not mean that everything remained hidden from society. Papyrus did not simply rest forever on a shelf. Texts travelled with people. They were consulted, recopied, excerpted, inherited, and sometimes buried. A working collection could be damaged by insects, damp, neglect, political disruption, or simple use. Much that mattered was probably preserved not only in objects, but in trained memory. The ability to pronounce, interpret, and perform what marks alone could not fully convey. When a teacher corrected a pupil, the institution renewed itself in a way no brick could record. Here lies the quiet source of the institution's influence. Kingship required words and images that placed the ruler within sacred order. Temples required compositions and specialists able to maintain ritual. Healers and ritualists drew upon bodies of learning. Archives and lists turned accumulated experience into something that could be carried forward. Those who kept such knowledge did not need to issue secret commands to shape the civilization. They shaped the forms through which command, worship, healing, and memory became intelligible. Its boundaries remain indistinct. A house of life in one city need not have matched its counterpart in another. The institution known in the Old Kingdom cannot be assumed to have worked exactly as one many centuries later. Its relations with archives, libraries, schools, scriptoria, and temple workshops overlapped in ways that were not necessarily identical. Even surviving uses of the name could reveal an ideal as much as a bureaucratic diagram. The differences must remain open. The incomplete shape does not make the House of Life insubstantial. On the contrary, it teaches us something important about Egyptian power. Institutions can guide a culture without leaving a constitution. They can be carried by titles, habits, buildings, collections, and relationships, rather than by a single charter. They can alter across time while preserving a recognizable purpose. Per-Ankh endured in the record because Egyptians repeatedly needed places where written knowledge could be made living, and much of that knowledge found its most solemn use nearby, beyond the bright courts and beneath the painted ceilings of the temple. There, as night thinned toward morning, texts left the shelf, purified hands approached a sealed shrine, and the ordered world had to be made new once again. The approach began long before the sanctuary door. A temple drew the visitor from openness toward concentration. Beyond the massive gateway lay courts where sunlight fell, and at certain times many people might gather. Farther in, columns thickened around the path. Floors could rise while ceilings lowered. The available light softened, then thinned. Side rooms held equipment, garments, oils, incense, vessels, and offerings. With each threshold, the number of people permitted to continue grew smaller. The stone itself spoke the language of access. The temple as a whole could be seen for miles, its processional way woven into the life of the town, yet its innermost chamber was not a public meeting place. The sanctuary sheltered the cult image, a material form in which the god could become present and receive service. Darkness, enclosure, and restriction did not imply that something shameful was being concealed. They marked a difference between ordinary space and the place where the kingdom's most delicate relationship was renewed. Before entering that relationship, a priest prepared his body. Egyptian sources from different periods do not give us one unchanging rule-book for every temple, but purification was fundamental. Washing, shaving, clean linen, abstentions, and attention to bodily condition separated ritual service from the disorder of daily life. Water drawn for purification could be linked symbolically with the fresh waters from which creation emerged. Incense purified through scent and smoke, clothing signaled readiness. The body of the officiant became part of the ceremony's exact arrangement. Around him, the temple depended on a diverse company: high priests, specialists in sacred texts, musicians, administrators, servants, craftsmen, and groups that might serve in rotation rather than remain inside the precinct every day. Titles and duties changed across time and place. The person who kept accounts for an estate did not necessarily open the divine shrine, and the one who recited a ritual did not personally manage every field that supplied it. Yet all these forms of labour met in the offerings placed before the god. On temple walls, the king is often the only human shown in the sacred encounter. He advances toward a deity, burns incense, pours water, presents bread, wine, flowers, cloth, or the sign of Ma'at. The image declares a theological relationship. The king is Egypt's representative before the gods, the one responsible for maintaining divine order. In practice, no ruler could stand before every cult image each morning across a long country of local sanctuaries. Priests acted in his place. Their authority did not remove the king from the scene. It allowed his ideal role to be performed again and again, far beyond the reach of his body. Before dawn, the officiant could move inward, carrying light into rooms that had remained closed through the night. Doors and seals protected the shrine. Spoken formulas accompanied the approach. The priest announced ritual purity and rightful purpose, not because a god needed ordinary information, but because correct speech established who was entering and in what capacity. Bolts were drawn. The sealed doors opened. Within, the small cult image waited inside its shrine. Pause here, because the image was neither an idol in the crude modern sense, nor a decorative symbol. Egyptian theology could hold a subtler relationship between divine power and material form. The god was not limited to wood, stone, or metal, yet could become present through a properly made, named, consecrated, and tended image. This presence required care. The daily ritual treated the divine form almost as a royal body, and almost as the centre of creation, awakening it into renewed order. According to the temple's sequence, the priest might prostrate himself, offer incense, speak hymns of praise, and remove the image from its enclosing shrine or open the shrine so that service began. Yesterday's garments and adornments were removed. The image was purified, anointed, clothed in clean linen, and furnished with ornaments according to the temple's tradition and resources. Cosmetics, oils, and incense carried both practical and sacred meanings. Every gesture placed the god again within a world made clean, distinct, and complete. The texts preserving such sequences are not simple transcripts of every morning in every sanctuary. They offer formal patterns, sometimes known from later copies, inscriptions, or particular temples. Real performance varied with period, local custom, available staff, and wealth. A great state temple and a smaller provincial shrine did not possess identical resources. Still, the surviving pattern reveals the central idea. Divine life was sustained through repeated, knowledgeable attention. Now the scene widens. Into the dark chamber comes the labour of fields, riverboats, kitchens, and storehouses, gathered as food offerings in abundance, at least in the ideal record. Bread, beer, meat, fowl, vegetables, fruit, cakes, wine, water, and other goods appear in offering, scenes, and lists. The god did not consume them as a human diner would. Their sacred essence could be offered first, after which the material food passed onward. It might be presented to other divine images, then distributed among temple personnel and dependents. In this circulation, estate, storehouse, kitchen, sanctuary, and household became parts of one system. Follow a single loaf backward from the altar, and the mystery changes shape. Grain had to be planted, gathered, measured, transported, and baked. Herds had to be tended. Vessels had to be cleaned. Lists had to be maintained. The most exalted moment before the shrine rested upon thousands of practical acts performed beyond it. At the same time, those acts were gathered into a sacred claim. By feeding the god, adorning the image, and speaking the proper words, Egypt helped sustain the order from which its own life flowed. Over every movement lay the pressure of time. The morning service belonged to the sun's return and the daily renewal of creation. Additional offerings and rites marked other hours, festivals, lunar cycles, seasons, and royal events. Calendars kept ceremonial time aligned with the rhythms of river, sky, agriculture, and inherited tradition. A missed delivery could become a ritual problem. A mistaken word or neglected purification could represent more than poor workmanship. Correctness was a form of protection against disorder. Here the phrase "master of secrets" takes on a quieter meaning. The secret might be the divine image itself, seen by few. It might be the words recited at a protected moment, the method of handling a sacred object, or the knowledge required to prepare an image, garment, or substance correctly. To possess this knowledge was to carry responsibility. The specialist was entrusted not with a thrilling rumour, but with an action that had to be completed in the proper sequence for the good of temple, king, community, and cosmos. At last the service ended, the image was returned to its shrine. Doors were closed and secured. The officiant withdrew with care, sometimes described as moving backward, so as not to turn casually away from the divine presence. The chamber fell dark again. Outside, the temple was waking into the practical sounds of another day, accounts being checked, vessels moved, workshops opened, petitions brought, animals fed, and deliveries received. Most people would never witness what had occurred in the sanctuary. Yet they were not wholly separated from the god. On festival days, the divine image sometimes left its chamber within a portable shrine, concealed yet carried into procession. Music, incense, banners, and crowds transformed the temple's guarded presence into a public encounter. Individuals could pray, dedicate objects, consult oracles in some periods, and approach accessible spaces and divine intermediaries. Egyptian religion was not divided into a secret faith for priests and an empty facade for everyone else. Public devotion and restricted service belonged to the same sacred landscape. The restriction itself created authority. A person permitted to enter the inner rooms had been purified, appointed, trained, and connected to an institution capable of supplying the rite. Correct action depended on remembered words, written models, material resources, and social trust. The sanctuary door separated more than one chamber from another. It distinguished levels of obligation. This is the shape of ancient Egyptian secrecy at its most visible. It was not a masked gathering beneath the temple, plotting the fate of pharaohs. It was a graded passage through real doors. It was the controlled custody of images and texts. It was the repeated discipline by which specialists made themselves fit to act on behalf of king and community. What remained hidden was hidden because sacred power was thought to require preparation, not because a single society wished to govern unseen. And when the doors had closed, the work of preservation continued elsewhere. The spoken formula had to be remembered. The damaged roll had to be recopied. The offering list had to remain intelligible to the next generation. Beyond the sanctuary, under a steadier light, the scribes of divine books bent once more over their signs. The light above those signs was modest. A shallow lamp, fed with oil, could illuminate the fibres of papyrus without filling the room. Beside it lay a palette with hollows for black and red ink, a water vessel, and brushes made from rush stems softened at the ends. The objects were simple enough to fit into a small wooden case. What made them powerful was the trained hand that knew how to use them. In the hand of a scribe of sacred or learned books, writing became more than the rapid notation of an account. Formal hieroglyphs preserved a world of carefully shaped birds, plants, bodies, tools, and divine emblems. They belonged especially to monuments and ritual objects, where the appearance and placement of a sign could participate in the meaning of the whole. Hieratic, the more flowing script used with ink, allowed many compositions to be written and recopied on papyrus, leather, wood, linen, pottery, or flakes of limestone. The two forms were related, but mastery of a swift handwritten sign did not make every ancient monument transparent, any more than recognizing a formal hieroglyph guaranteed ease with the compact habits of a working document. Across Egypt's long history, language and handwriting changed. A composition inherited from centuries earlier might contain old expressions, rare spellings, or signs, no longer common in daily correspondence. The copyist therefore worked across time. He might reproduce a revered wording precisely, adapt a passage to a new setting, add an explanation, or preserve an ambiguity that later eyes would have to resolve. We see corrections placed above a line, cancelled signs, or words inserted where something had been missed. These small traces return the human hand to texts that can otherwise feel as though they arrived from eternity. The title, Scribe of the Divine Book, suggests the special prestige attached to some of this work. Its bearers could be associated with temple learning, ritual performance, and the interpretation or preparation of sacred material. Yet titles do not provide a complete job description, and their duties were not necessarily identical in every age. A divine book might guide a ceremony, define the correct form of an image, collect names and invocations, or preserve knowledge required for a particular sacred task. To copy it was not merely to duplicate information. It was to renew a usable instrument. Before a text could be renewed, materials had to be gathered and prepared. Papyrus sheets were made from the pith of a plant that flourished in wet ground. Strips were laid in crossing layers, pressed, dried, joined, and smoothed into a surface on which ink could travel. Soot supplied the body of black ink, while red pigment distinguished certain elements. A roll represented plant growth, skilled work and expense before the first sentence appeared. This helps explain why discarded pieces might be reused, while inexpensive ostraca served for exercises, memoranda, and drafts. Watch a manuscript gradually fill beneath the brush. The scribe pauses to moisten the tip, looks back to the exemplar, and finds his place again. A repeated line tempts the eye to leap ahead. A damaged sign asks for judgment. Perhaps another copy is available for comparison. Perhaps an older colleague remembers the missing phrase. At other times, the unresolved space is carried forward. Preservation was never a single heroic rescue. It was a chain of ordinary decisions, any one of which might clarify a tradition or allow part of it to fade. Around that scribe, collections required their own forms of order. Scrolls could be stored in boxes, jars, cupboards, or rooms connected with temples, palaces, and administrative offices. Labels and docketing helped distinguish one document from another. Inventories could record materials, while lists arranged names and categories for teaching or consultation. These were not modern libraries, freely browsed by any curious visitor. Some texts were working records with a short practical life, opened for the demand of the moment and then set aside. Others were old compositions valued enough to be copied repeatedly, their continued presence dependent upon trained hands. One role answered the present, another carried the distant past forward. The room held no single kind of knowledge and offered no single path to it. Access followed office, training, purpose, and place. Now let one particular role open beneath the lamp. The work we call the onomasticon of Amenemhotep, known through copies from the later New Kingdom, and after carries us through ordered groups of words, aspects of the heavens, waters, peoples, offices, settlements, buildings, lands, agricultural things, and other parts of the experienced world. It is not a dictionary in our familiar alphabetical sense, nor a secret book revealing one hidden doctrine. It is a learned arrangement of names, gathering the diversity of creation into an intelligible sequence. The composition identifies itself with the teaching of a scribe of the sacred books in the House of Life. That association opens a rare window onto what the ordering of knowledge could mean there. To list a thing correctly was to recognize its place among other things. A pupil moving through such groups did not merely collect vocabulary. He learned the distinctions through which an administrator, ritualist, or scholar might describe the world. Kinds of people, ranks of office, features of land, products of labour, names that joined the visible order to the written one. There is something peaceful in the movement of the list. One word follows another, each placed carefully beside its neighbours. Yet classification also carried authority. The person able to name offices understood hierarchy. The person able to distinguish landscapes, materials, and commodities possessed tools for managing them. The person who knew an old or restricted term could read texts closed to a less trained eye. Vocabulary formed a map, and maps are never entirely separate from power. The pupil's road began with copying, but it did not end there. Model letters taught forms of address. Accounts trained the eye in quantities and measures. Literary compositions displayed elegant language and the virtues expected of an educated official. Lists built memory. Ritual and scholarly works demanded specialized instruction. A pupil learned not only what signs meant, but which register belonged to which occasion, how a title should be written, where a formula began, and when a word carried a danger or sanctity requiring unusual care. Sometimes the explanation of a difficult passage entered the written tradition. A scribe might supply a gloss for an uncommon word, place alternatives beside one another, or transmit commentary that helped later readers navigate an inherited text. At other times, interpretation remained oral. A teacher could explain pronunciation, gesture, timing, or context that the written surface only suggested. A manuscript by itself was therefore never the whole of knowledge. The living chain ran from exemplar to copy, from teacher to pupil, and from words to competent action. Guarded vocabulary did not always require a cipher. Difficulty could be its own gate. An old composition, densely written and filled with specialized names, was inaccessible to someone who lacked years of practice. Some texts also warned that their contents should be used only by authorized or knowledgeable people. Such cautions are enticing to modern readers, but they do not require a hidden creed. They point to a world in which words could have consequences. A ritual mishandled, a divine form wrongly identified, or a preparation made with the wrong substance was not harmless ignorance. archives, and learned collections carried the memory of institutions. A royal grant could support a later claim. A sequence of priestly service could preserve obligations. A ritual book allowed a ceremony to continue after everyone who had once performed it was dead. A list of divine names protected distinctions that time might otherwise blur. Through such records, a temple remembered beyond the span of any individual servant. Then the lamp catches a ragged edge, and the fragility of the entire tradition returns. No archive remembered by itself. Papyrus darkened and frayed. Ink faded insects fed upon plant fibre. Water, fire, abandonment, and political change could empty rooms more completely than deliberate secrecy ever had. Even stone was recut, reused, or left to wind and sand. Egyptian continuity, so impressive from a distance, rested upon vulnerable acts repeated close at hand, opening the box, unrolling the text, teaching the sign, correcting the line, and making another copy before the old one failed. The scribes of divine books shaped Egypt through this patient renewal. They did not need to possess every text or agree upon a single body of doctrine. Their influence lay in keeping particular words available when a ritual, office, workshop, or ruler required them. They helped decide which old forms could speak in the present, and how the present would be made legible to the future. Sometimes the need for learned words was immediate. Beyond a copying room, someone lay awake with fever, pain, a wound, or a fear that had no visible source. A physician examined the body. A ritual specialist prepared a spoken protection. A priest invoked a divine power both dangerous and healing. In that quiet chamber, the border between medicine and magic was far less certain than the one a modern listener is inclined to draw. Step into that chamber with modern categories already fixed, and the world its practitioners held together begins to divide. We separate medicine from religion, diagnosis from prayer, and material treatment from spoken protection. An Egyptian healer could distinguish among causes and methods, but he did not need to choose between an observable injury and a world inhabited by gods, hostile forces, the dead, and the power of correctly spoken words. The body belonged to all of these realities at once. More than one kind of specialist could approach the patient. The title, commonly translated as physician swan debut, appears across Egyptian history and could belong to people attached to the palace, an estate, a work community, or other institutions. There were also priests of the goddess Sekhmet, whose dangerous force was associated with disease, and whose favour could bring protection. Ritual experts, including lector priests skilled in recitation, confronted harmful influences through words and actions. Exorcistic and protective roles overlapped with healing in ways that resist a neat modern chart. These specialists were not necessarily gathered into one medical order, nor did every healer perform the same work. Titles reveal fields of authority more readily than they reveal the full scene at a patient's side. A person might hold more than one learned or priestly office. A palace physician served within a different social setting from someone treating members of a labouring community. The surviving picture changes greatly from one period to another. Even so, the range of titles shows that care of the body could draw together trained observation, preserved remedies, ritual knowledge, and divine relationship. On the surviving medical papyri, this combination comes quietly into view. Some passages proceed through cases in a disciplined sequence. The healer examines a wound or injury, notes what he finds, reaches a judgment, and prescribes treatment. Other passages collect remedies for disorders of the skin, stomach, eyes, limbs, teeth, or other parts of the body. Ingredients are measured, ground, mixed, cooked, applied, swallowed, or used as washes. Alongside these practical actions appear incantations, mythic comparisons, amuletic protections, and appeals to divine beings. To modernize. The page almost invites a dividing line. Rational medicine on one side, superstition on the other. Yet that line tells us more about our habits than theirs. Spoken words could be part of a treatment just as a bandage or salve was. A remedy could work through the recognized qualities of a plant, mineral, animal substance, oil, honey, or resin, while a recitation placed the patient within a protective sacred story. One method did not automatically cancel the other. Together they addressed an illness that could be physical, social, emotional, and cosmic. Picture the healer drawing near enough to observe. He asks what happened. He touches the injured place, notices swelling or heat, tests movement, listens to the patient's account, and looks for signs that suggest what could follow. Some ancient case texts distinguish conditions that can be treated, conditions that require struggle, and conditions for which little can be done. That willingness to recognize limits is striking. Egyptian practice was not an endless promise of miraculous cure. Experienced healers knew uncertainty, danger, and failure. At the same time, a sickness without an obvious wound might be understood through relationships invisible to touch. A malign force, an angered deity, or a troubled dead person could enter the explanation. Fever and epidemic danger could be associated with the fierce powers of Sekhmet. To address such causes was not for the Egyptian patient to abandon the real world. The divine and invisible were parts of the real world. Protective speech restored boundaries around a vulnerable person, and enlisted powers believed capable of repelling what had entered. The words themselves had to be right. A spell might identify the sufferer with a god who had escaped a comparable danger, or command a harmful being to depart. It could be spoken over water, oil, a bandage, a figurine, or another object, joining the recitation to material action. Names mattered, because knowing a name gave precision to the appeal. Myth mattered because a story of divine injury and restoration provided a pattern into which present suffering could be placed and made intelligible. Now let the lamplight move from the patient's skin to the rolled texts kept close at hand. The scribal world was never far away. Remedies and recitations could be preserved in written collections, but the page still required interpretation. Ingredients named in an old text might be difficult to identify. Quantities and methods demanded experience. The healer needed to decide whether the present case resembled the one described. A spoken formula needed a voice, timing, and purpose. As in temple ritual, knowledge became effective only when marks were translated into competent performance. House of Life titles sometimes occur in connection with physicians and learned specialists, and later Egyptian traditions place the institution near the production or custody of medical and ritual knowledge. The association matters, but it cannot be stretched into a single national school of medicine with one curriculum. We do not know that every physician trained in a House of Life, or that every such institution held the same collections. The clearer picture is a shared environment in which writing, ritual expertise, and healing could meet. In that meeting, knowledge acquired an intimate kind of power. Royal inscriptions declared order upon enormous walls. A healing text brought ordered words close to the skin. In the sanctuary, the priest purified a divine image. Beside the bed, another specialist purified a person or a substance. In the archive, names were placed into lists. In a protective recitation, the correct name helped identify a threat and command it away. The scale changed, but the underlying faith in skilled arrangement remained. Daily care must often have been quieter than the surviving texts can show. Someone fetched water, warmed a mixture, cleaned a wound, or held a lamp. Family members watched and waited. A child's cry, an old person's laboured breath, or the sleeplessness of pain filled the room around the formal words. The written tradition preserves prescriptions and cases, not every expression on the healer's face. Yet the setting allows us to understand why restricted knowledge inspired trust. The specialist arrived, carrying procedures, names, and remembered experience that others did not possess. Such trust also created authority. A healer who could read a learned roll, recognize a plant, judge a fracture, or speak a protective formula occupied a threshold between fear and possible relief. His knowledge might be inherited through family, learned from a teacher, gained through temple service, or shaped by repeated practice. It did not make him infallible, it made him someone permitted to act when uncertainty had entered the household. The goddess Sekhmet embodies the tension beautifully. She could be imagined as fierce, burning, and capable of bringing destruction, yet her priests were associated with efforts to understand and avert dangerous affliction. The force that threatened life could also be approached for protection. Healing did not always mean defeating an alien darkness. It could mean restoring a relationship, cooling what had grown too hot, or persuading a powerful presence to turn from anger toward mercy. Not every remedy deserves to be romanticized, and effectiveness cannot be assumed where the evidence cannot establish it. Some ingredients may have soothed, cleansed, protected, or nourished. Some treatments may have caused harm. Many are difficult to assess because ancient names and preparation methods remain uncertain. Nor should we dismiss the comfort supplied by ritual as if comfort were nothing. A practiced sequence, a familiar divine story, and the presence of an authorized specialist could give form to terror at a time when illness felt formless. Here, the House of Life earns its name most gently. Life was not preserved by a single secret formula. It was attended through accumulated observations, copied recipes, sacred speech, trained hands, and the willingness to remain beside a suffering person. The institution's power, where it touched healing, lay in bringing memory into a room where the present body was in danger. And the same learned hands that restored order on this intimate scale could be summoned for the most public body in Egypt, the body and office of the king. A ruler also had to be named, protected, renewed, and placed correctly within the world. Before he could look timeless on the temple wall, many specialists had to make his kingship intelligible to gods and people alike. Kingship did not begin at the moment a crown touched the ruler's head, nor was it completed by the strength of one person. A man might inherit, seize, or be chosen for the throne, under circumstances shaped by family, court, army, and fortune, to become pharaoh in the full Egyptian sense. However, he had to enter a sacred pattern older than his own life. Names, crowns, rites, images, festivals, and proclamations placed the new reign within the order of the gods. Specialists made that placement possible. Priests knew the ceremonial sequences. Scribes prepared names and decrees. Artisans fashioned regalia and images according to inherited forms. Officials arranged appearances, journeys, offerings, and announcements. Timekeepers and learned personnel aligned rituals with the appropriate calendar. No single group created a king on its own, and the evidence for coronation is uneven across periods. Yet royal authority repeatedly depended upon knowledge that the ruler could not personally contain. The king's titulary offers a quiet example. A pharaoh possessed several formal names and titles, each expressing a relationship to gods, land, and royal tradition. These were not merely private labels written inside recognizable frames and repeated upon monuments, seals, vessels, and documents. They announced how the reign should be understood. Choosing and composing royal names required a vocabulary of legitimacy. The new ruler was introduced not as an isolated individual, but as the bearer of an enduring office. When those names were carved, they travelled farther than the king himself. A cartouche on a temple wall connected building and offering to royal patronage. A seal impression placed an object or transaction beneath institutional authority. A date counted by regnal year allowed administrators to locate an event within the life of the reign. The sovereign became a system of references, repeated by people who might never see his face. Royal images performed a similar work. On the walls, the king remained perfectly composed as he offered to one god after another. He wore the crown suited to the setting. His scale, posture, gesture, and position followed conventions that made his identity immediately clear. The image was not a casual portrait of an ordinary day. It was a carefully constructed truth about office. The king acts, the god receives, and Mart continues. To create such a scene required more than stone cutting. Someone selected the ritual moment, arranged the figures, established proportions, supplied names and epithets, and checked the completed inscription. Drafts and models could guide the work. Learned tradition governed which divine forms belonged in a place, and what words accompanied an offering. The artist's skill gave the scene a body, while scribal and priestly knowledge gave it sacred precision. This reciprocal relationship can cast two misleading shadows. In one, priests and scribes secretly manufacture a powerless puppet. In the other, royal inscriptions make temple institutions look like passive tools. The quieter reality is that kingship and learned authority sustained one another. The ruler endowed temples, appointed or confirmed offices, commissioned monuments, and presented himself as guardian of divine order. Temple specialists renewed that claim through ritual, image, calendar, and memory. Each gave the other a language in which power could endure. The calendar was one of that language's most delicate forms. Festivals had to occur in recognized relation to seasons, lunar patterns, local traditions, and the civil year. Anniversaries and royal rites connected a present reign to sacred events and remembered predecessors. Learned observers and scribes kept lists, calculated intervals, and preserved instructions. Variation and calendar drift could complicate practice over long periods, but the essential purpose remained. Royal and divine life had to be renewed at the proper time. During a festival, the guarded world of the temple could open outward. A divine image, often concealed within a portable shrine, left the sanctuary in procession. The king might participate in person or be present through image, title, and officiating representatives. Roads, river journeys, music, incense, banners, and gathered crowds joined sacred geography to public experience. Behind the visible splendor stood preparation. Routes made ready, ritual texts consulted, offerings assembled, personnel assigned, and the sequence preserved. The procession's grace rested on that unseen sequence, carried out before the guarded doors opened, and the crowd gathered beyond them. Then the years pass, and the ceremonial world turns from accession toward renewal. The festival later known as the Sed presented royal vitality as something that could be restored through ritual action. Its forms changed, and not every king celebrated it in the same way or at the same point. Monumental scenes could even claim the renewing power of a ceremony beyond the literal occasion. The image did not simply report renewal. It helped make renewed kingship permanent even beyond the event it represented. Beyond festival music and carved scenes, royal rule depended upon more ordinary writing. Decrees established privileges or obligations. Letters carried instructions. Boundary inscriptions, appointments, and legal records extended authority into institutions and communities. Officials translated general command into particular work, while reports travelled back towards centres of decision. Sacred legitimacy did not replace government. It gave government a cosmic horizon, allowing the collection of labour, defence of territory, judgment of disputes, and maintenance of temples to be described as parts of ordered rule. The specialists who served this system drew influence from a ruler's need for continuity. A new king entered offices already occupied by experienced people. He inherited archives, ceremonies, building traditions, diplomatic relationships, and networks of local authority. Learned servants could advise, interpret precedent, and present options. Families established in temple or administrative office might preserve influence across several reigns. But need did not amount to complete control. Kings appointed, rewarded, divided, displaced, and sometimes punished officials. Courts contained rivalries. Institutions negotiated rather than obeying one hidden will. And eventually, the same relationship crossed the threshold of death. A pharaoh's mortal body required preparation, protection, and burial, while his royal identity had to pass into an enduring sacred form. Embalmers, priests, scribes, artisans, and administrators contributed different knowledge. Coffins, amulets, funerary texts, tomb equipment, images and rites surrounded the dead ruler with names and transformations. The tomb itself placed architecture, labour, material wealth, and learned tradition at the service of royal memory. Funerary knowledge could be restricted because it dealt with dangerous transitions and sacred bodies. Titles connected with secrets appear among those responsible for embalming or protected spaces. Yet the existence of such specialists does not reveal a society standing above the king. Their work was commissioned within royal and temple institutions. It made the passage from dead ruler to effective ancestor imaginable, repeatable, and materially present. Memory then became a continuing political resource. A successor could honour a predecessor, complete a monument, adopt an earlier style, or place himself within a long line of legitimate kings. He could also alter names and images, redirect a building, or weaken the remembrance of a rival. Scribes and craftsmen performed these choices in ink and stone. Their hands did not necessarily decide the policy, but without their knowledge, the policy could not take durable form. Thus the king shaped the institutions that shaped kingship. He granted resources and prestige to temples. Temples returned sacred recognition. He commissioned learned work. Learned work fixed his reign within the language of eternity. He stood at the centre of official scenes. Countless specialists maintained the conditions that allowed those scenes to exist. The circle was neither perfectly harmonious nor secretly one-sided. It was a relationship renewed through dependence. From the sanctuary, this relationship is visible in offerings and names. From the archive, it emerges in decrees, calendars, and models. But beyond both lay a larger body of fields, herds, workshops, boats, kitchens, storerooms, and workers. Every festival required supplies. Every endowed cult required continuing support. Every monumental claim rested upon substances that had to be counted and moved. As the temple doors opened to the morning, another kind of order was already stirring in its courtyards and estates. Scribes checked deliveries. Grain waited in sealed rooms. Craftsmen took up tools. The sacred institution that gave kingship its eternal form was also an economic machine built from land, labour, and the patient arithmetic of daily provision. The grain in those sealed rooms had begun its journey far from the sanctuary. It grew in fields where the river's retreat left dark earth beneath the sun, was cut and gathered by labourers, measured at threshing floors, loaded into sacks or baskets, and carried toward an estate, a landing place, or a local storehouse. By the time a portion reached a temple granary, many hands had already entered the story. Sacred abundance was never weightless. It came from soil, water, animals, boats, tools, and human effort. A large temple, therefore, extended well beyond its stone enclosure. Its support could come from fields, gardens, vineyards, herds, fishing grounds, workshops, and settlements, whose obligations connected them to the cult. Some resources were granted by kings, others accumulated through long patterns of donation, production, and administration. Land attached to a temple could lie far from the god's sanctuary, so that an institution visible in one city depended upon workers and officials scattered across a much wider landscape. No single plan describes every temple in every century, for the surviving evidence is uneven. A provincial shrine with modest local support cannot be treated as a smaller copy of Karnak, just as a royal mortuary foundation did not necessarily function like a town temple. Endowments changed, boundaries changed. A strong king might reorganize property or personnel, while disorder could interrupt deliveries and loosen supervision. Yet at many periods, the larger institutions possessed enough land, storage, and skilled labour to become durable centres of economic life. Their needs were constant because ritual was constant. Bread and beer had to be prepared. Cattle, fowl, vegetables, fruit, oil, wine, cloth, incense, flowers, and precious materials entered different ceremonies and workshops. A divine image required linen, unguents, ornaments, and repaired furnishings. Lamps consumed fuel. Doors needed carpenters. Metal fittings needed smiths. Damaged vessels needed replacement. Festival days enlarged the demand, drawing together extra offerings, transport, musicians, attendants, and food for many people. Offerings presented before the god did not simply vanish. After their sacred use, much of the material could return to the human community of the temple through established distributions. Portions supported priests and other personnel, whose service might be organized through ranks or periods of duty. Bread from an altar thus belonged to more than one world. It was a gift to the deity, a renewal of order, and part of the material system that sustained those who kept the cult functioning. Behind the visible offering stood a workshop. Grain became flour. Flour became loaves in forms suited to daily use or ceremony. Barley and emmer became beer. Linen passed through planting, harvesting, spinning, weaving, washing, and storage before it could clothe either god or servant. Stone, wood, metal, pigment, leather, and faience moved through specialized hands. Some workers spent their lives close to temple institutions. Others may have entered through temporary duties outside contracts, family ties, or obligations difficult to separate into our categories of public and private. Accounting gave this movement a memory. A delivery could be counted at its arrival, identified by source, compared with an expectation, and placed under seal. A withdrawal could be recorded for a festival, a workshop, a ration, or another institutional need. Scribes worked with measures and valuations familiar to their own time, checking commodities that differed in kind and quality. The purpose was not abstract mathematics for its own sake. It was to know whether the storehouse could meet tomorrow's requirements. The storehouse itself helped make accounting visible. Mud brick granaries enclosed grain behind walls that moderated heat and restricted entry. Doorways and containers could be sealed, so that opening them left a trace requiring explanation. One official might measure while another recorded, checked, or witnessed. Such divisions did not prevent loss or dishonesty, but they created a chain of responsibility. The mark impressed in wet clay joined a physical doorway to the name and office of the person answerable for what lay beyond it. Yet careful columns and sealed doors could not make the system perfect. Grain spoiled, jars broke, animals died, boats were delayed by wind or low water. Measures could be disputed, entries corrected, and officials accused of withholding what was due. Any account is also an argument made by the person who prepared it, shaped by what the institution wished to count. The columns that survive cannot reveal every informal exchange, every household arrangement, or every compromise made at a distant field. Now step out of the storehouse and follow those accounts toward the river and the painted tomb of the vizier Rekhmira. There, in a new kingdom scene, products arrive from communities of southern Egypt as assessed dues. Cereals dominated much storage, but varied regions supplied varied goods. To gather them required estimates of productive capacity, recognized authorities, landing stages, rivercraft, handlers, guards, and granaries large enough to receive what arrived. The word tax can help us imagine such an obligation, but it can also mislead. Ancient Egyptian dues did not fund a modern state with the services and budgets familiar to us, and payment was not usually a matter of coins passing from citizen to treasury. Assessments could concern harvests, herds, commodities, or labour. The boundaries among royal revenue, temple endowment, local obligation, and the resources of elite households were not always sharp. A more faithful picture is one of intersecting claims upon production, not one uniform national tax system. Here the palace and temple met again. Royal authority could dedicate land and goods to a god, confirm exemptions, appoint administrators, or redirect resources. Temple estates helped sustain rights that declared the king's role in cosmic order. Officials might hold titles in both sacred and administrative spheres, while elite families moved through offices that a modern observer would separate into religion, government, and household management. What looks like a clear opposition between crown and priesthood may dissolve when the same people and resources crossed both worlds. For many workers, this system arrived not as a theory of wealth, but as a ration: grain, bread, beer, oil, fish, or cloth could compensate labour and support a household in a world where coined wages were not the normal measure of employment. A delayed delivery, therefore, reached into domestic life. The temple ledger, the royal work crew, and the family cooking pot were never as distant from one another as monumental walls might suggest. This does not mean that interests were always harmonious. An estate manager wished to meet an obligation without emptying his stores. A central official wished to secure what had been assessed. Temple personnel defended privileges that allowed their institution to continue. A ruler facing military or building demands might regard accumulated wealth as available for a wider purpose. Negotiation, patronage, favour, and rivalry entered the system because institutions were made of people rather than columns of numbers. Through all of this, temple wealth created influence of a durable kind. A granary could feed workers during scarcity. A workshop trained specialists. A fleet of riverboats connected distant properties. An archive preserved grants, claims, inventories, and precedent. The institution knew which village supplied grain, which family held an office, which field belonged to an endowment, and which festival would consume the stored oil. Material resources and information strengthened one another. This was power, but not the secret power of a hidden chamber. It was visible in boats at the quay, cattle driven along a road, dust rising from a threshing floor, and scribes bending over delivery lists. It endured because the temple could gather, store, transform, and redistribute the substances of ordinary life, while giving those acts a sacred purpose. The sanctuary's darkness rested upon an immense daylight labour. Nowhere did that joining of devotion, wealth, royal favour, and institutional memory become more imposing than at Thebes. There, generation after generation of New Kingdom kings added gateways, courts, obelisks, shrines, and estates to the service of Amun. Stone accumulated around the god as grain accumulated in his stores, and with it grew the weight carried by those who spoke and acted in his name. At first, Amun had been a god whose importance was especially rooted in Thebes. His name could be understood as the hidden or concealed one, a quality that later ages found irresistible, though it did not make his servants members of a hidden order. The rise of Theban ruling families during the Middle Kingdom raised the standing of their local deity. Over time, Amun was joined with the great solar god Re, and praised as Amun-Re, a creator and king of the gods whose reach could extend far beyond the city where his sanctuary stood. His greatest ascent came with the New Kingdom. The rulers who drove foreign kings from the north and reunited the land emerged from Thebes, and military success was remembered beneath Amun's protection. Campaigns into Nubia and Western Asia brought wealth, captives, tribute, and prestige into royal hands. Kings returned part of that abundance to the gods, above all to Amun. The gift proclaimed gratitude, but it also proclaimed legitimacy. Victory proved that the god favoured the ruler. The ruler's gifts made that favour permanent in stone and property. Karnak grew through this exchange. It was not conceived all at once by a single mind. Pharaohs opened new courts, raised pylons and obelisks, extended processional ways, altered earlier structures, and placed their names beside the god. The complex became a landscape of accumulated reigns. A visitor passing through it encountered not only Amun's sacred presence, but a history of kings who had sought to bind their memory to his. The institution surrounding the temple grew as well. Estates provided grain, livestock, wine, linen, and other necessities. Workshops and storerooms supported daily cult and festival display. Scribes, stewards, inspectors, craftsmen, agricultural workers, boat crews, guards, musicians, and priestly ranks filled a long chain of service. Not all lived within the temple, and not all were priests. To speak of the wealth of Amun is to speak of a broad economic and administrative domain whose edges reached into many lives. Then, on great festival days, the whole system came into motion. At Opet, the images of Amun, Mut, and Khonsu travelled from Karnak toward Luxor Temple, carried in sacred boats amid music, incense, officials, and watching crowds. The divine image remained sheltered, but the movement of the god entered the city and joined temple ritual to public experience. Boats, roads, provisions, and ceremony had to be coordinated on an impressive scale. Amun's power was guarded at its centre, yet proclaimed openly in motion. At its summit stood offices of considerable honour. The high priest of Amun carried ritual authority and could stand close to the divine image. But he was also an elite figure inside the royal order. Other senior priests and administrators managed particular cultic or material responsibilities. Appointment could depend on the king, court influence, experience, and family position. Some offices passed within powerful families often enough to create continuity across generations, though inheritance was neither the only path nor a guarantee against royal intervention. The families themselves warn us against drawing a clean line between palace and temple. A man associated with Amun could also bear a royal administrative title. His relatives could serve in the army, court, or provincial government. A daughter could hold a prestigious religious office, while marriage linked the household to another centre of influence. What we call the priesthood was not always a separate class, facing the state across an institutional divide. It belonged to the same upper world of kinship, education, patronage, and service, from which many royal officials came. This overlap made cooperation ordinary and conflict possible. A king relied upon Amun's cult to celebrate festivals, confirm sacred order, and present victory as divine approval. Temple office holders relied upon royal endowment and recognition. Yet a wealthy institution possessed its own memory and momentum. A high priest could advise, negotiate, and gather supporters. A family entrenched in office could outlast a short reign. Interests that were usually entwined could pull in different directions when succession, resources, or policy became uncertain. Then the procession reaches a point where ceremony becomes decision. A question is placed before Amun. During such processions, the god's image travelled within a shrine carried by priests, and movements of the divine bark were interpreted as assent, refusal, or choice. Oracular consultation could address appointments, disputes, property, and matters of royal importance. To those present, the response belonged to Amun, not simply to the men beneath the carrying poles. Picture the watching faces as the shrine shifts above the carrying poles. From our distance, suspicion quickly asks whether the priests manipulated every movement. Human agency was certainly involved, and interpretation gave trained participants influence. But reducing the entire practice to a concealed trick would miss its social reality. The king, officials, priests, and witnesses shared a world in which the god could act through ritual forms. An oracle's authority depended upon that accepted relationship. It could strengthen a decision because it placed judgment beyond one mortal voice, even while mortals prepared the question and carried out the answer. This was institutional power in its most delicate form. It did not need a secret council issuing orders from behind the throne. It arose from trust, property, office, family networks, ritual access, and the ability to present decisions within a sacred language recognized by others. At moments, those resources gave Amun's leading servants enormous influence. At other moments, kings altered appointments, promoted rival temples, redistributed wealth, or made their own priorities unmistakable. The long New Kingdom contained many such balances. Strong rulers could lavish gifts upon Amun without appearing weakened by them, because the god's splendor magnified royal splendor. Hatshepsut used Amun's support within the presentation of her unusual kingship. Thutmose III celebrated campaigns and offerings at Karnak. Later rulers continued to build, restore, and inscribe. The temple's greatness was not evidence that the crown had surrendered. It was, for much of the period, one of the crown's chosen forms of greatness. Later, when the inscriptions open their inventories of land, animals, vessels, and personnel, the scale can be breathtaking. Yet those totals may record ideal claims, cumulative donations, or categories whose administration we only partly understand. Numbers impressive enough to suggest an independent empire within Egypt should not be made to say more than their context allows. They establish vast resources and organizational reach, not automatic control over every person those figures seem to contain. Yet gifts persisted after the giver died. A field remained productive, an office remained desirable, and a wall continued to speak a royal name. Across centuries, Amun's domain could accumulate what no single reign had created. That durability mattered especially when central government weakened near the close of the New Kingdom. Economic strain, contested authority, external pressure, and unstable succession reduced the ability of later rulers to command the land as earlier conquerors had. In the south, senior men connected with Amun's temple became increasingly prominent within a changing political world. Some combined priestly dignity with military command. The high priests at Thebes could exercise authority of a kind that looks almost royal in surviving monuments, while rulers in the north claimed kingship over Egypt. But even here, the old image of priests overthrowing the pharaoh and seizing a shadow state is too simple. Generals, royal families, temple households, and regional powers were entangled. Authority divided and recombined rather than passing neatly from one institution to another. What endured was the usefulness of Amun's name. A ruler with uncertain reach could still seek the god's recognition. An elite family could root its standing in temple service. A community could continue festivals even as dynasties changed. The temple stored not only grain and precious objects, but procedures for making authority visible. In a time of instability, such continuity carried unusual weight. The priesthood, then, did not shape Egypt by secretly replacing every king. It helped shape the terms in which kingship, victory, judgment, donation, and restoration could be understood. Its influence expanded where royal favor, accumulated wealth, and accepted sacred authority met. Sometimes those forces supported the throne, sometimes they constrained a ruler's choices, sometimes they survived him and waited for a successor. And once in the 18th dynasty, a successor attempted to change the relationship with startling force. The familiar name of Amun began to disappear beneath chisels. Temples turned toward the open light of another god. A new capital rose on an untouched stretch of desert, as if sacred order might be written again upon a clean surface. Yet even there, among the palaces and sun courts of Akhenaten, the house of life left its mark. The change did not arrive in a single morning. The king, later called Akhenaten, came to the throne as Amenhotep IV, bearing a name formed around Amun and inheriting the temples, officials, and ceremonial language of his predecessors. Early in his reign, he still moved within much of that inherited world, yet his attention settled with increasing intensity upon the Aten, the visible disk of the sun, whose rays descended toward the king and queen in the new images taking shape around them. Solar worship was not new to Egypt, nor was the Aten an invention created from nothing. What became new was the concentration of royal devotion, resources, and representation around this form of divine light. At Karnak, Amenhotep V began building for the Aten near the precinct long associated with Amun. The new temples favoured openness. Instead of drawing ritual inward toward a cult image in a dark sanctuary, their courts exposed rows of offering tables to the sky. The artistic language changed beside the architecture. The Aten appeared as a disk extending rays that ended in small hands. The royal family occupied the space beneath, receiving life and offering worship. Akhenaten and Nefertiti were shown with their daughters in scenes of movement and intimacy unusual in earlier formal art. Access to the god was presented through the royal household, with an intensity that narrowed the older field of divine relationships. Around the 5th year of his reign, the king changed his name from Amenhotep, meaning that Amen was content, to Akhenaten, a name declaring his relationship to the Aten. He chose a new royal city in Middle Egypt, on a desert bay bordered by cliffs. Boundary inscriptions claimed the site for the Aten. It became Akhetaten, the horizon of the Aten, known today as Amarna. The city rose quickly. Palaces, administrative buildings, houses, workshops, roads, royal tombs, and great open temples spread along the eastern bank of the Nile. Sunlight entered its sacred architecture as an active presence. Offerings accumulated beneath the Aten's rays, while reliefs repeated the royal family's privileged nearness to the god. The move drew court, labour, and resources away from older centres, although the extent and pace of change beyond the capital varied. As the reign continued, Amun became a target. His name and image were attacked on monuments in many places, and other divine forms were also affected. Carved signs were cut away, inscriptions altered, and institutional attention redirected. The campaign demanded organised labour. Someone issued instructions. Someone identified the offending names. Stoneworkers climbed walls and entered chambers to remove what earlier stoneworkers had been ordered to preserve. The chisel marks make the phrase "war on memory" feel almost literal, but the kind of war matters. It was not a modern search for every private belief, and the evidence does not show a single moment when all traditional religion vanished from every household. Ancient practice was too broad, local, and deeply woven into life for such a clean erasure. Nor can every damaged sign be assigned with certainty to one policy. But the assault on Ammon's written presence was extensive, deliberate, and politically charged. In Egypt, a name allowed a being to remain active in the world. To erase Ammon's name was therefore more than to remove a label. It challenged the god's presence in monuments, offerings, and royal memory. It also struck at the institutions and families whose authority had grown around his cult. Akhenaten's religious program and his political choices cannot be neatly separated, though we should resist reducing his devotion to a mere disguise for economic seizure. Belief and power could inhabit the same act. The paradox at Akhetaten is that radical change still required trained continuity. A new city needed accounts, plans, letters, calendars, artists, scribes, ritual procedures, and administrators. It needed people who knew how to turn royal desire into words, buildings, supplies, and repeated performance. Even an attempt to remake sacred order depended upon the inherited crafts of government and temple learning. Now leave the damaged walls for something smaller, a mud brick pressed with the signs for the House of Life. Such bricks were found in a complex near the place used to store royal documents, positioned within the central zone between palace and Aten temple. Papyrus fragments with coloured images were also recovered from the area. The evidence is incomplete, but the institution's presence is unmistakable. Pause over that small survival, because it changes the shape of the story. Akhenaten did not abolish learned organisation itself. He required it. The House of Life at his capital may have served the new religious and royal order through the preparation, custody, or production of suitable texts and images. We cannot reconstruct its staff or contents in detail, and we should not imagine that the same institution secretly opposed him from within. What we see is more subtle. Specialist knowledge could be redirected even when the divine names at its centre changed. Then the centre began to shift again. Akhenaten's project did not long survive him. The years after his death are difficult, marked by brief reigns and uncertainties of succession. Before long, the young king Tutankhaten changed his name to Tutankhamun. The court left Akhenaten, and traditional cults received renewed royal support. A restoration inscription from the young king's reign described temples as neglected, and the gods as having turned away from Egypt. Like all royal proclamations, it shapes the past to justify the present, but it also reveals the official scale of the reversal. Restoration was physical labour before it became historical judgment. Damaged names had to be recut. Divine images had to be repaired or replaced. Priestly personnel and temple revenues had to be confirmed. Offerings had to resume, buildings reopened, and old ceremonial knowledge made usable again. Scribes consulted surviving forms, artisans entered wounded spaces, administrators reconnected resources to cults. The return of the gods was carried out through inventories, appointments, grain, plaster, pigment, and stone. It was not a simple return to an untouched past, because no past waits untouched. Restorers made choices about what to repair, what to recopy, and whose name would claim the act. Tutankhamun and his immediate successors began renewal, while Horemheb and later kings appropriated some restorations, dismantled Aten monuments, and sought to remove the Amarna rulers from legitimate royal sequence. Small building blocks from Akhenaten's temples were reused as fill inside later structures. Hidden within new masonry, they survived because they had been condemned to disappear. The struggle over memory therefore moved in both directions. Akhenaten's agents cut away Amun. His successors cut away Akhenaten. One reign treated earlier divine names as a threat. Later reigns treated the recent royal experiment as disorder. Yet neither erasure was complete. Fragments remained in inaccessible places, names escaped a chisel, and buried blocks preserved scenes no one intended future eyes to see. The people who performed these transformations were not necessarily the authors of policy. A scribe copied the new royal name, because that was the name now ruling. A stoneworker removed one god, and later restored another. A priest returning to office could belong to a family injured by the interruption, or simply to a new arrangement created in its wake. Institutional memory outlived individuals by adapting, but adaptation always carried human costs and choices. Here the idea of a secret society becomes especially inadequate. No hidden brotherhood held one unchanging doctrine beneath the conflict. We find competing royal programs, altered cults, displaced personnel, enduring techniques, and institutions capable of serving different sacred visions. The deepest continuity lay not in resistance to all change, but in the trained ability to make change legible, material, and repeatable. Archives, inscriptions, and ritual knowledge helped decide what Egypt would remember, but they did not possess memory alone. Memory lived in buildings, processions, family claims, reused stones, local devotions, and the habits of hands. To restore a name was to invite an older presence back into the present. To erase a name was to acknowledge, almost fearfully, that the presence might otherwise endure. Centuries later, visitors would look upon temples whose walls carried these layers of devotion, damage, and repair. They would meet priests who guarded learned traditions and monuments older than their own cities. From that encounter grew another kind of memory, the image of Egypt as the keeper of a single primeval wisdom, concealed through the ages. The scattered house of life would fade from view, while the legend of an ageless hidden order began slowly to take its place. It did not take shape all at once. Like the monuments themselves, the legend was built in layers, each age adding its own inscription to what earlier ages had left behind. Greek travellers encountered Egypt over many centuries and under changing political conditions. Some came as merchants or soldiers, some as diplomats, settlers, or pilgrims, and some knew Egypt mainly through stories carried across the Mediterranean. They saw temples already ancient by any measure familiar to them. They met priests who served gods with long genealogies, preserved ceremonial calendars, and could point toward reigns extending into a past that seemed almost without a beginning. To an outsider, the combination of great antiquity and restricted learning was powerful. Egypt appeared not simply old, but close to the first sources of order. From encounters like these, writers gave the impression a durable form. Herodotus, writing in the 5th century before the Common Era, filled his account of Egypt with customs, sacred animals, monuments, and conversations attributed to priests. His work remains invaluable, but it is not a clear window through which we can watch an Egyptian priesthood exactly as it was. He selected, arranged, translated, misunderstood, and compared. The people who informed him also selected what to tell. Greek questions met Egyptian answers through interpreters, conventions, and the storyteller's art. Other Greek authors made Egypt a setting for reflections on age and wisdom. In philosophical literature, an Egyptian priest could become the voice of a past older than Greek memory, preserving a teaching lost elsewhere through flood, fire, or human forgetfulness. Such scenes reveal the prestige Egyptian antiquity held in Greek thought. They do not, by themselves, prove that the conversations occurred as written, or that one priestly body guarded a single doctrine from the first morning of creation. This distinction is easy to lose because the image is so beautiful. An elderly priest stands beside a column covered in signs. A visitor arrives from a younger country. Beyond them wait chambers holding records of vanished kings and worlds forgotten by everyone else. In that quiet meeting, Egypt becomes memory itself. Yet the Egypt encountered by Greek visitors was not a fossil. Its temples and learned communities continued to change, especially after Alexander's conquest and during the Ptolemaic and Roman periods. Greek-speaking and Egyptian-speaking traditions lived beside one another, sometimes in tension and often in exchange. Gods could be compared, translated, or joined. The Greek Hermes, patron of interpretation and writing, came to be associated with Thoth, the Egyptian god of writing, reckoning, learned speech, and sacred knowledge. From this meeting emerged the figure later called Hermes Trismegistus, Hermes the thrice great. Works attributed to him offered teachings about the divine mind, the cosmos, the human soul, spiritual rebirth, astrology, alchemy, and the ascent toward knowledge. The writings, now grouped under the broad name Hermetic, were not all produced at one moment or by one school. They belong largely to the Greek and Roman era world, and many were written in Greek within the culturally mingled environment of late antique Egypt. They are a genuine part of Egypt's long intellectual afterlife. Egyptian religious ideas, temple settings, divine names, and priestly forms helped shape the world from which they came. But they are not stenographic records of secret lessons whispered unchanged since the Pyramid Age. Nor do they reveal the constitution of a hidden order that governed pharaonic Egypt. Their Hermes is a sacred author whose authority rests partly upon imagined antiquity, just as many ancient texts placed wisdom in the voice of a revered figure from the distant past. This was one of the great transformations in the story. The real house of life, known to us through scattered references, titles, bricks, and fragments, gradually became less visible than the ideal of an Egyptian sanctuary containing complete and primeval wisdom. The varied priests, scribes, physicians, administrators, and ritual specialists of different cities and centuries were gathered by later imagination into a single silhouette, the Egyptian initiate. That silhouette travelled remarkably far. When Hermetic writings reached new readers in Renaissance Europe, they seemed to offer a voice from the deepest antiquity. Scholars translated and discussed them as witnesses to an ancient theology they believed preceded, illuminated, or harmonized with traditions better known in Europe, because their true historical setting was not yet understood. Hermes Trismegistus could be imagined as a sage older than the famous Greek philosophers, standing near the beginning of all philosophy. Then the signs themselves deepened the spell. Before hieroglyphs were deciphered, many European readers believed they did not represent a spoken language in the ordinary way, but concealed pure ideas, divine truths, or universal symbols beneath animal and human forms. A carved wall, therefore, seemed like a silent book of mysteries awaiting the properly prepared mind. We now know that hieroglyphic writing was a rich and flexible writing system tied to the Egyptian language, capable of recording names, titles, offerings, narratives, sounds, and grammar. Its beauty remains. What changed was the belief that beauty itself proved a hidden universal code. As centuries passed, Egyptian imagery entered many currents of European esoteric thought. Obelisks, pyramids, the eye, the winged disk, the names of Isis and Osiris, and the figure of Hermes could be rearranged within new systems. Ceremonies of initiation were dressed in an Egyptian atmosphere. Fraternal groups, occult schools, artists, novelists, and stage designers all found uses for the same compelling scenery: the lamp, the veil, the subterranean chamber, and the patient guardian of forbidden knowledge. By then, the Egyptian image belonged to many different worlds. Some traditions were serious attempts to explore religion and philosophy. Some were symbolic dramas, some were imaginative reconstruction, and others were entertainment. They tell us a great deal about Renaissance hopes, modern spiritual searching, colonial fantasy, and the enduring human wish that a lost source of wisdom might still be recovered. They do not supply a bridge of documented membership from a New Kingdom house of life to a modern lodge. No verified roll links all Egyptian temples into one brotherhood. No surviving charter gives a central command authority over every priestly, scribal, and medical office. No continuous chain of initiation can be followed securely through the Persian, Greek, Roman, late antique, medieval, and modern worlds. Similar symbols do not prove an unbroken organization, especially when later people openly borrowed from the monuments and books available to them. Even the titles that seem most secretive become more precise when returned to their setting. A master of secrets might be entrusted with a ritual, a craft, a sacred place, a royal concern, or procedures of embalming. The phrase marked authorized nearness to restricted knowledge. It did not function like a universal password shared by every learned Egyptian across 3,000 years. What the ancient evidence offers is less unified and more alive. It shows houses of life whose organization was not identical everywhere. It shows temple libraries and archives teaching relationships, priestly rotations, households that carried offices, physicians with sacred titles, artisans trusted with divine forms, and administrators whose accounts kept offerings moving. These networks could overlap without becoming one body. They could compete, cooperate, inherit, adapt, and disappear. Their distributed character was not a weakness. It was one reason Egyptian forms could endure interruption. When a capital moved, expertise could move with it. When a monument was damaged, Another copy might preserve the formula. When royal favour shifted, an institution might contract in one city and flourish in another. There was no single hidden chamber on which all memory depended. There were many rooms, many teachers, and many hands. Perhaps this is why the historical truth can feel quieter than the legend. A supreme order gives history a single mind. It promises that every monument belongs to one plan, and every upheaval conceals one will. The real past asks us to accept thousands of choices, careful, ambitious, devout, self-interested, practical, and sometimes contradictory. It asks us to imagine continuity made not by immortals, but by people who arrived each morning and performed work learned from someone before them. And so the later occult image and the ancient institution should not be forced to cancel one another. The image has its own history, rich with longing and invention. The institution has its fragmentary evidence, modest in places and astonishing in its consequences. We can stand close enough to appreciate both, while keeping the narrow space between them clear. From that space, the question with which we began returns in a slightly different form. We no longer need to ask whether one ageless brotherhood secretly directed Egypt. We can ask instead how a society entrusted parts of its memory to restricted communities of knowledge, and how those communities, without ever becoming a single society, helped shape the civilization around them. The answer waits where our journey began, at the temple threshold in the last darkness before dawn. The outer court lies beneath a paling sky. Columns remain half lost in shadow, and the stone beneath them holds the night's coolness. Farther within, a lamp burns in a chamber we cannot enter. Its small flame does not reveal a council gathered to command the kingdom. It illuminates a more ordinary scene, perhaps a papyrus unrolled on a low surface, a reed pen, a bowl of ink, and a trained hand preparing to renew words that would otherwise vanish. Was there, then, a secret society that shaped ancient Egypt? If we mean one centralized brotherhood, possessing a single doctrine and ruling every pharaoh from behind closed doors, the evidence does not allow us to say yes. No membership list has emerged from the sand. No archive describes an all-Egyptian command. Across thousands of years, the institutions themselves changed too greatly for such a simple continuity. But if the phrase is allowed to soften, it points towards something real. Egypt was shaped by communities whose knowledge was restricted, whose training could be inherited or earned, and whose authority rested upon skills most people did not possess. The house of life belonged to this world, but never stood alone within it. Temple priests, scribes, physicians, ritual specialists, artisans, administrators, and learned families formed networks through which sacred and practical knowledge passed. They shaped Egypt when they calculated a festival date and when they recorded a delivery of grain. They shaped it when they prepared medicine, purified a sanctuary, copied an old composition, carved a royal name, or restored the image of a god damaged by an earlier reign. They made kingship visible and temples workable. They joined fields and storerooms to offerings, illness to remedies and prayers, human rule to the immense balance called Mat. Their influence was profound, but it was never limitless. Kings granted estates, appointed officials, redirected wealth, closed cults, and founded new cities. Local temples followed local histories. Families rose and faded. Foreign conquest, political division, new languages, and changing forms of worship altered the landscape again and again. The learned institutions of Egypt did not stand outside history. They survived within it for as long as people could adapt their practices to a changing world. That may be the most important secret the evidence has kept. Continuity was not stillness. The civilization that now seems carved from eternal stone was renewed through fragile acts. Papyrus could split, ink could fade, and mud brick rooms could collapse into shapeless earth. A teacher might die before passing on a difficult text, An archive could burn, a temple lose its income, a name be struck from a wall. Every preserved formula therefore depended upon choice. Someone had to copy it. Someone had to teach the signs, remember the sequence, gather the materials, and decide that the old words still deserved another life. Even stone required such care. Monuments endured because later people repaired them, reused them, walked among them, or sometimes buried them while building something new. What survives is not everything Egypt knew. It is the small and uneven portion that escaped neglect, destruction, accident, and time. There is something gentler in this answer than in the legend of a hidden order. It returns history to human scale. We do not need unseen masters drawing a perfect design across the centuries. We need a scribe leaning close to the page. We need a priest learning the dawn ritual until movement and speech become exact. We need an administrator checking measures in a granary, a physician remembering which remedy belongs to which wound, and an artisan cutting a sign deeply enough for a name to meet the future. Some of these people sought influence, some guarded privilege, some served family ambition or royal power. Others may simply have believed in the dignity of correct work. The networks they formed were not always benevolent, and restricted knowledge could exclude as surely as it preserved. Yet taken together, their repeated labour gave Egypt much of the continuity that later visitors mistook for timeless, hidden wisdom. Now the riddle turns one last time. The secret society, then, was a society without one name because it was never one organisation. It was a pattern of entrusted knowledge running through many institutions. Stand once more before that visible door. Even the word secret must be held lightly. Much of this authority was displayed in public. Temples dominated city horizons. Priestly titles were carved upon tombs, and royal ceremonies announced the bond between gods, kings, and learned service. What remained restricted was not the fact that specialists existed, but the deeper access their offices allowed, the inner chamber, the difficult script, the exact sequence of a rite, the knowledge of a body, a calendar, or an archive. Egyptian secrecy could be visible at its edges. Everyone might see the door, while only a few were prepared and permitted to pass through it. Its members did not gather in a single chamber. They were separated by cities, offices, generations, and sometimes by conflict. What joined them was not an immortal oath, but the conviction that order had to be made again each day. Now the first light reaches the temple wall. A bird calls from the river reeds. Somewhere beyond the gateway, the settlement begins to stir, while inside, doors open in their appointed sequence. A lamp bends as someone passes. Papyrus whispers beneath careful fingers. A name is read, and because it is read, it lives for one more morning. We can remain at the threshold. There is no need to go farther. The darkness within no longer has to conceal a conspiracy in order to hold wonder. It is enough that real people entered it carrying water, linen, oil, ink, memory, and responsibility. It is enough that their quiet work helped a civilization speak across ages they could never have imagined. And as the ancient night gives way to dawn, you can let these halls recede. Let the columns become shadows, the river a silver line, and the last lamp a distant point of warmth. If you have enjoyed this quiet journey, you can leave a gentle like, subscribe for another history told slowly, or add a comment with the place from which you listened, or the mystery you would like us to explore next. For now, rest. The names are safe in the lamplight. The papyrus is folded, and the temple settles once more into silence.